3,000 years of slavery. Mostly because you are asking in an English, European forum. I believe most Myanmaris, Tibetans, Koreans, etc. don't think white Europeans are the worst slavers. Go to some non-English, European forum. Ask them in their languages and report back. In other words, it's a Euro-Western-centric opinion that white Europeans are the worst slavers. It's not a universal opinion held by the entire human race. My guess would be that it was the most prevalent form of slavery during the Enlightenment era, which was when the concept of individual liberty started to grow in importance. As others have mentioned, American history is a short history and slavery was a relatively recent part of that history. Combine that with the long period of post-slavery oppression of black people in America, e.g., segregation, unequal education, Jim Crow, redlining, lynching, up to and far beyond the civil rights movement, and it combines into a huge evil perpetrated by a supposedly civilized people, the effects of which can still be seen in modern society, e.g., ghettos and cycle of poverty. There were times and places where slavery was more directly brutal than what happened in the U.S. In some societies, slaves got worked to death on a regular basis, with extremely low life expectancies. Whereas in America, slaves could more or less expect to live out a life, maybe shorter than if they were free but long enough to marry and raise children, with that brutality spread over a much longer time, but also with the knowledge that their family and descendants would all be victims of the same system. But the thing about African slavery is that it's a big part of America's history. And America is a relatively young country. It's not necessarily that it was better or worse to be a slave in the U.S. It's just that it had such a large impact on modern society. It's easy to divorce current society from the slavery of Rome, the Ottomans, or mentioned in the Old Testament, etc. But we can still see the effects of slavery in America, and as such we need to stay focused on it in a way that we don't really need to emphasize with other forms of historical slavery. 10,000 plus years would be more accurate, and because it's the most recent and because of where you live, slavery is an ongoing issue. It's not that it was the worst of all. It's that it was the most recent and is still affecting the society around us. It's a bit like saying, there were evil leaders doing horrible things all through history. Why is there so much emphasis on how evil Hitler was? I think the combination of recent, brutal, and in the US, of course you guys are going to care more about your own history than other people's. It's the one you live in the aftermath of the most. After all, it's also not very long ago. And while it wasn't the only brutal slavery history has seen, it was still bad. I would guess all these contribute. Additionally, you had a war partly over that issue. Civil wars leave deep scars. We don't have the same focus on my ancestors' slavery here. Norway. It's 1,000 years ago. It stopped fairly organically. It wasn't the worst of slavery, though it was plenty bad enough. No one is defending it, or saying it wasn't really a problem. And the enslaved population that didn't go home was largely just integrated in the larger population. No one will see a person with red hair and go, "Oh, vaguely bad person." It's just some genes that got contributed at some point. Like everything else. It basically just feels like we're done with it. And, at least as seen from over here, it feels like you guys are not. There's a lot of good info in here. But one particular fact to remember is that the slavery of the 17th-19th centuries, specifically the white enslavement of black Africans through the triangular trade, was chattel slavery, total ownership of the entire person, their offspring, their labor, and their life. The slavery seen in ancient cultures vary very rarely matched such totalizing ownership. Everyone has their own history they are the most familiar. This is where the most emphasis is. Look, you did all this long list trying to be inclusive. Yet none of those are much relevant to my people. In some of the Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Russia, so on. Slavery ended in 1861. My people gained their freedom at the same time as slavery ended in USA. I really don't see why there should be competition or equal representation about who suffered the most. I don't know what country you are from, but I assume people in your country are more familiar with your country history, and this is what is being emphasized. I don't expect you to be as familiar with history of my country as much as you are familiar with yours, because the Europeans kept the best records of it. Previous empires usually covered 1/8 to 1/4 of the globe at most, so their shenanigans only had a limited regional impact. Western superpowers have scaled it up worldwide. When they didn't draw up arbitrary maps in Africa, Asia, and South America, they have been busy toppling governments galore. No one is fighting today because of something the Qing dynasty, the Pharaoh or Caesar did. But there's a handful of modern-day conflicts that you can trace back to Western meddling, from the Industrial Revolution onwards. It's because it was far more recent. The last slave died in 1971. Donald Trump was born in 1946. He was 25 when that happened. There are people on Reddit who were alive then, and more people who ha parents who were alive then. And because it's important to know how horrible it is, because even warning about how horrible it is, there are groups who are trying to reinstate it. 300 or so years ago is more modern history, and it's ridiculous that slavery is still a part of it. Thousands of years was plenty of time for societies to figure out that slavery is inhumane and shouldn't continue, but it does anyway. As an American, my duty is to American history. A nation that claims all men are created equal is going to get slammed for race-based generational slavery, because of how systematic and industrialized they were in doing it, unlike regular slavery, which is still widespread today. The slave trade the 17th–19th century was an entire industry in its own right. Other forms of slavery usually had an end date, for starters. Slavery existed for way more than 3,000 years. It's because European colonization worked, and those under it and minorities in their own European countries still face systemic issues that were built on the same self-interest. It is far-reaching strategies that are embedded in the fabric of capitalist society now. That said, if you go to all the other regions, there's their own variation of those issues. You'll hear about Arab racism issues in that region, etc. Chances are you don't have much contact with people from those other regions, hence you don't know how it was and is today. Lots of reasons. Being more recent means it has more consequences to the present, and that the scale is very large. Relative to ancient slavery, more recent slavery would have coexisted with more widespread understanding that slavery was bad. It wasn't like no one knew slavery was bad. A lot of people knew. Being combined with colonialism caused the slave trade to explode on a scale that was previously unheard of, and especially dehumanizing, even compared to indentured servitude, which was also immoral. Chattel slavery got real bad and real big in the West. Part of it is that we have such large governments now that everyone is a little more invested in not rocking the boat than before to prevent WW3. So our interactions with major issues in foreign countries are mostly money-based now. So modern slavery, though very terrible, is at times lost in the noise as something we can't do a lot about except stop buying certain products. That is also weakened by capitalism, where we get used to all of our purchases having at least some unethical practice behind them. And probably dozens of reasons I didn't even think of. More recent history is much better recorded. And yes, chattel slavery produced quite a few horrors that may not have been nearly as prevalent in some other forms of slavery.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Eracast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.